All right, so on your syllabus, this should have been the last day of class, but I wanted to reorder it a bit. So we're just going to move things forward after this. But I suppose with the videos, you can watch them in whatever order you want. Um, what I normally do with this is I want to talk about the agroecosystem and putting what we've learned in botany to work for the benefit of humanity. And then there's a whole chapter on this that I think is worth reading. So let's start with the definition, which I always like. So here is the greater West Lafayette area, or at least sort of southwest of town. The agroecosystem is defined as a spatially and functionally coherent unit of agricultural activity. It includes, right, remember it's an ecosystem, so it includes living and non-living components and their interactions. Remember our definition of the ecosystem was that it was the communities plus the abiotic environment. And what's unique about the agroecosystem is that unlike natural communities, there are really clear boundaries because of the way humans build things, right? So if you look at the sort of agroecosystem around West Lafayette, you can see that this field is very different from this field that I'm pointing at, right? And it's because farmers plant different things, they use different management practices, they maybe spray or maybe they're organic, and there's all kinds of differences. Ones over here seem to be sort of intertwined by forest, which actually may bring benefits in terms of pest control. And so the agroecosystem in some ways is easier to study because we know that something changed as you move from this field over to one of these fields over here. So what they are is they're like microcosms of ecology and evolution. They're much simpler than natural systems, right? And it's because farmers manage them. So if you remember, we talked about the Ross Reserve forest that we would have done the lab in as being like 1,000-dimensional with hundreds of thousands of interactions. Agroecosystems, diversity is kept low on purpose. Right? So not every weed can invade a really tall cornfield. And the weeds that invade tall and short corn and soybeans, respectively, are different. So there's fewer interactions, and many of them are even controlled by spraying. So weeds are removed, and certain herbivore pests are removed. And then much of the physical environment is also managed, right? Many fields are irrigated or at least have drain tiles to control the water table level that farmers often fertilize and all of that stuff. So we can take a little timeline of ecology and evolution and agriculture and how it went through time, right? So scientists think around 10,000 BC was when people figured out the basics of evolution, and it's thought that this was probably by accident, and that people started selecting for yield and non-shattering varieties, right? And you can imagine that this is just going to happen by accident, that if I am a human 10,000 years ago and I decide, you know what, I'm going to plant this thing I'd like to eat and have a monoculture of it, those individuals whose leaves shattered and fell before I went and got them would be lost to me whether I did anything or not. And those few individuals that held their seeds more tightly are the ones that I'm going to collect and plant next year, just through sort of almost natural selection at that point. And then, it took about 9,000 years, but from 10,000 BC to the 1800s, we gradually learned to control the ecology of fields, right? We started to control nutrient cycling. We started to control enemies and weeds and other things. Notice that mutualism is on here, although often pollination is something that we do control. But right? And then machines. Machines probably undid some of the ecological understanding in the 1960s because it allowed us to sort of sit behind a wheel and you didn't have to pay as much attention to the natural cycle of things. But it gave us tremendous power, right? Farming became mechanized, and this mechanization is probably the reason why me and most of you are able to be at the university, because 100 years ago, we probably would have been out in the fields hand-picking corn. And then from the 1960s, apparently there's a typo, to the 2000s, genetics. There was the biotechnical revolution, and we unlocked the power of genetics to know exactly what changes we wanted to make. Instead of doing them by accident, we could either through really targeted breeding or through genetic modification, we could make very targeted changes, which is pretty cool. So that's all Damon's world, and maybe a little bit Mike's. And then today, the future is all about data, right? You all thought pivot tables were useless, but the future is what they're calling Internet of Things or digital agriculture, where farmers are starting to use drones to make very specific reconnaissance to find out, okay, I've got this disease in this corner of the field, this corner of the field needs to be fertilized. And you can imagine that by using that data to say, I'm only going to add fertilizer in this corner because it's all that needs it, you can save money, right? Because farming is a business. It's not only about getting the most yield, which fertilizing the whole field would give probably the most yield, but it would reduce the farmer's profit because they only needed to fertilize a quarter of the field, and now they can save money, so they get the same benefit with reduced cost. And so the future is very data heavy in farming. The agronomy department just hired 2 new people in this sort of digital agriculture field. It's going to be the future of agriculture. Right, so you look at some of the things that people are working on, and the 21st century agriculture, 21st century plant biology is extremely data driven. People are starting to install sensors. People are starting to use drones, like I said. They're even starting to make automated self-driving tractors and things like this. It's a cool time to be interested in agriculture. And so, yeah, I wanted to show you this, that this is sort of the growth that we got, right? So you can see that around where the dots turn from yellow to blue is when machines have an effect. So you can see that they fit using Excel by the look of it, 3 separate lines. And they suggest that there was basically no change until suddenly we got machines, and that was good. Now we could harvest a bit faster, we could have bigger fields. But then this is the effect of genetics, which is pretty cool. And what's neat about this change from about 1960 onward is that you can see that the average farm size got bigger because of machines. So the average farm size got bigger, but which meant we had fewer individual farms because farmers would consolidate, but that we didn't really change the amount of land we were using, right? So we get this massive increase in agricultural yield with the same amount of land, even potentially slightly less land. If you look at this, it's curving down. And indeed, what you can see is that with basically either the same or even slightly fewer inputs, this is just showing the same thing I just said, that the total agricultural output has been increasing rapidly since the 1950s. And then, like I said before, you can see going from this goes from the year 1400, this might be a little small, up to 2012. And you can see back in the Renaissance, 1400, 1500, as much as 75% of the labor force from Italy, France, the Netherlands, and England, as much as 75% of the workforce. So that's me, that's most of you were working in the agriculture industry. By the 1800s, this had dropped to 50%, and today it's less than 5%, right? And so machines and genetics have what allowed us to leave the farm and study science to potentially make the farm even more productive. All right, so many of the principles of ecology we've learned can be applied to agricultural systems to improve their function, right? Because now the ecosystem function of the agroecosystem is food production. We can potentially change them to increase sustainability and yield, right? With data sensors and automation, makes it easy to do almost any kind of thing you can imagine. So I want to give you some examples of things we've learned in the class that might be, in my section of the class, that might be useful, right? So I told you that plants over-allocate to leaves and stems to maximize their ability to get light. Remember, we talked about how city trees often look like this, but if you cut down a forest and left only one tree, they're all reaching for the sun, right? But this reduces reproductive output, right? The plant that invests all of its photosynthate into getting tall, well, there's a trade-off there, right? That allocation trade-off we talked about. Every molecule of carbon that goes into the stem is a molecule that can't go into corn production. Right, so natural selection will maximize competitive ability because this is what maximizes your ability to grow in a forest. If you don't grow tall in the forest, then someone else will, and your genes won't be passed on. But in an agroecosystem, we control the selection. We can say, you know what, this would make sense in a forest, but it doesn't make sense in our agroecosystem. So stop it. Right, and in many ways, the Green Revolution accidentally was about these above ground games, right? And so it was about fertilizer and tractors coming on board and artificial selection. And so what they did was they started selecting for dwarf varieties of various crops. And my understanding is the reason they did this was because synthetic fertilizer had been invented as a function of World War II. And when they fertilized the traditional varieties, they would get so big they would tip over. And so the people like Borlaug were basically able to say, oh, I get it, let's just make them shorter. And so you can take a look at wheat. This is an old picture of some of those old varieties of wheat and the dwarf varieties. You can see there's selection for them to be smaller and smaller and smaller. And that basically you could imagine that what they did unintentionally was they removed this above ground height gain that we've talked about. A postdoc in my lab who's since gone on to work at the Salk Institute is Mina Rostamza, and she's been looking at root length that plants make in the presence of competitors. And in particular, she looked at soybeans. So the Green Revolution removed the above ground game, but what Mina was able to find was that soybeans are still playing this below ground game, that the plants almost double their root production when they're in the presence of a competitor compared to when they're alone. So the below ground game hasn't received nearly as much attention. And she did this by using a camera that we could stick into this clear tube and take pictures of roots. Okay, so another example using game theory is that we can genetically engineer crops so they become toxic to certain pests, right? So we can add defense, right? So, and this is in fact what BT corn was. They took some genes from bacteria, put it in corn, and this basically meant that certain insects could no longer digest what they ate, and so they would die out. But you can imagine that this puts an enormous evolutionary pressure on the plant enemies to evolve resistance. And they do, right? And so what companies suggest is that you plant a refuge, 20% sort of refuge, so that it minimizes the selection, right? So over here we have strong selection for the enemy to evolve resistance, but over here we don't. And by letting those coexist and mixing the genes, we can potentially drive coexistence of resistant and non-resistant types. Other options are we just mix it in so that you accidentally are planting resistant individuals. And so really what you're trying to do, right, is that, right, you've got the BT corn and you've got the refuge. And what you can hope to do with this is basically drive coexistence. That's actually the best you can hope for if you think through the game. Yeah, that's the best you can hope for, is that these guys will evolve and you'll get coexistence. But hopefully with coexistence, it's not as bad as perfect resistance. I'm not sure the companies realize that they're selecting for coexistence. And in fact, so here's a meta-analysis that looked at certain pests, so all kinds of invertebrates, across on corn and cotton. It seems like only corn and cotton, across a number of countries: Australia, China, the Philippines, USA, South Africa, India. You can see on the map here where they had all the data from. And they evaluated 24 cases of evolved BT resistance. Normally I would ask you to guess how fast you think this happened. So maybe make a guess in your head right now. What they found was that it was 8 years on average. It took about 8 years on average for resistance to evolve, and sometimes it was as fast as 2 or 3 years. And so if I add that standard deviation, remember that gives us the certainty of what we know, right? So that means that most of the time, 95% of the time, give or take, it takes somewhere between 4 and 12 years for resistance to evolve. And that's with a ton of different herbivores in a ton of different parts of the world. It's pretty impressive. And then the third example I want to give you is density-dependent population growth. I already gave you this exact slide, right, where we talked about the self-thinning effect, where if we have the density of plants, if we manipulate the density of plants in a field, that the size of each individual goes down over time. This is called the self-thinning rule. And we also talked in population biology about how we could take the differential equation of population growth over time, and we can make what's called a rate level plot in differential calculus, which is just the rate, so the slope of this as a function of the dependent variable. And what we get for the logistic population growth is this hump-shaped relationship where the most reproduction happens at this intermediate population size that we can calculate. And again, in fact, that's exactly how farmers decide, or rather the companies, decide what density they should plant their crops at. They do this experiment where they plant corn at a bunch of different densities. Some that they expect to be silly and low, and some they expect to be silly and high, and that allows them to identify the best spot in the middle, right? You have to overshoot it on both sides in the experiment. Okay, so there's just 3 quick examples that I came up with about things that we've learned in my section of the class that could be useful to agroecology, right? One of them is that you can potentially breed plants that don't fight each other as hard, breed less competitive plants using principles of game theory. You could potentially, some of the companies have thought that you might be able to avoid pest resistance by having these refuges that with BT resistant and non-BT resistant corn. Although game theory shows us that the best they can do is probably foster coexistence of resistant and non-resistant pests, and that we could potentially maximize crop yield using the sort of mathematics of population dynamics. And a lot of these things people have been doing for decades, sometimes without knowing it. So what I would like to do for this class is that's going to be the end of what would have been Monday's lecture. We are going to kind of use the rest of the time today to make a sort of secret review discussion section. I would like you to think through Botany 111 principles that you learned that could either increase crop yield or potentially improve agricultural sustainability, or, because agronomy is not only about making more food, it's also about how do we keep the farm running in the long term. So protecting the health of the soil, preventing runoff of dangerous chemicals into water systems, anything like that. All right, so that's what I just said. So what I would like you to do is think of anything you've learned in any of the 3 sections. So that can be genetics, physiology, or ecology. Post your idea to the discussion board I'm going to make in enough detail that I can understand, that everyone in the class can understand. Name the process that you're using. So for example, population dynamics or water potential. This shouldn't be the 3 I just gave you. If you can find a link, feel free to post that as well, but it can just be an idea from your notes. And then I'd like you to engage with your classmates' ideas. So ask them questions or make comments, and you should do this 3 times. You can also answer your classmates as one of your 3. And so this is a pretty short lecture. I really like you to spend some time in the discussion, using it as an opportunity to review your notes. All you really need to know today is what is the agroecosystem and how does it differ from a natural ecosystem. All right, guys, hopefully this discussion review thing helps you out a bit.